Good Wednesday night, everybody, and welcome back to another long awaited video. I took a break over this past weekend because I went to two Metallica shows and they just literally wore me out. So you're finally going to see the 19 movies that I watched in October. And a few of these movies I have reviews on the channel. So if you want to check them out, be my guest. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the first dual review that I did in October, preparing for my top 50 horror movies. And that is The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. And I'll just put up two posters here. These are childhood classics of mine. I do consider them to be action horror. They are both really, really fun. The first one is not as memorable as The Mummy Returns, in my opinion. But in the first one, it just literally starts up the whole story where Rick O'Connell comes across cursed Egyptian land and he resurrects Imhotep by reading from the Book of the Dead. Well, it's actually Evie that does that, but you get the point. But Brendan Fraser is the heart of these movies. He is just like a horror version of Indiana Jones, if you get my drift. So, and the second one, it takes place about 7 or 8 years after the original, and now they have a son, and the son comes across this cursed bracelet that used to belong to the Scorpion King, and whoever wore that bracelet and doesn't get it off in the next week, the host dies. So it's up to Rick to get his son to the Scorpion King's pyramid or something. Like I said, both of these are really, really fun, and I have a blast out of both of them. So those are the first two movies I watched, The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Next, I took a slight break from horror. The next movie I watched, and the only other new release besides two others that I saw in theaters. This was a movie that came out at the end of September, but I just didn't have time to check it out, so I watched it October 2nd or 3rd. That movie is The Creator. And this is a new sci-fi movie that deals with genetically artificial intelligent clones, I think. It's got something to do with AI. And John David Washington has to look over this robot looking girl to save humanity. This movie was alright, but I do not see myself ever rewatching it. It has the beats of Blade Runner, Terminator, Avatar. This just feels like a sci-fi's greatest hits compilation molded into a movie that you think is original, but really isn't. So, I'm like a casual fan of sci-fi myself, so I went into this to see what it was, and it went over my head the second I walked out. So, it was fine, but like I said, I don't see myself ever rewatching it. But that was The Creator. The next one is a rewatch of The Exorcist. And I have 3 separate Exorcist reviews on the channel. I reviewed the original. I reviewed the next movie I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. And I also read the book and reviewed that. But this is the story of an average family. It's just like a single mom and her daughter. The daughter plays with like a Ouija board and communicates with what she thinks is Captain Howdy. But it turns out it's a demon called Pazuzu. So it's a very, very slow build movie that envelops you in terror, and you don't know if she's faking it or if it's just like a bout of schizophrenia. Turns out she was possessed, and I really do enjoy this movie quite a bit. It is very hard to rewatch because of the subject matter. But once the exorcism happens, it's really terrifying. So, I have the full review on my channel if you want to check it out. So, that was The Exorcist. Followed by Exorcist Believer. And this was the second movie that I saw in theaters in October, and I actually featured it in 2 of my videos where I did like a review on it, and 4 recently released horror movies that I find pointless. But this is a legacy sequel that adds to the lore, but it also just feels unnecessary. But the only thing that this relates to The Exorcist is the appearance of Ellen Burstyn as Chris McNeil, which played the mother in the original. But this one focuses on like 2 girls getting possessed. And it's kind of like the same setup as The Exorcist, but you don't know a thing about these girls. And apparently, one has to die and one has to live. That's what I got out of this movie. I found it to be kind of lazy and very forgettable. It was kind of like a dud to me. So that was Exorcist Believer. Followed by Pet Sematary Bloodlines. And this was a Paramount Plus original movie that premiered the first week of October, so October 6th. And this is like a prequel to the remake that came out in 2019. And this focuses on a young Judd Crandall. And he meets his wife, which is Norma. That's his girlfriend at the time, of course. And they get together and they want to join the Peace Corps. But one of Judd's friends, Timmy Baterman, comes back from the Vietnam War, and his father buried him in the pet cemetery, and he comes back as a zombie. Now, did this movie need to exist? No. But it's not terrible. I don't think it just needed to exist. Now, I'm a big fan of the original Pet Sematary, but I like the book a lot more than the movie. This movie just added to the story, and it kind of like added to that flashback sequence in the novel, except Timmy Baterman, I believe, was a veteran of World War One. I might be wrong there, but Judd Crandall was already elderly, so this focused on a younger Judd Crandall, so a Vietnam vet makes more sense. I thought this movie was just fine, but that was Pet Sematary Bloodlines, followed by my next dual review, House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. So, I threw these on to determine if they were to make my top 50 horror movies, and they did. They're like literally in the middle of that countdown. So, this is Rob Zombie's directorial debut, and it's like a salute to 70s grindhouse exploitation films. So it's in the vein of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it just features like these 4 college kids getting stranded at a gas station, and they pick up this hitchhiker, which is played by Sherry Moon Zombie, and she leads them back to the Firefly house, which is just a house full of sadistic murderers. This movie is not for the faint of heart. It's gory and dark as shit. It really goes there. So the saving grace of this movie is this guy right here, Captain Spaulding, and I believe Sid Haig was probably the best part of this trilogy. But we didn't get to see much of him in Three from Hell because he passed away. But I really do enjoy this movie. It's not for everyone. It knows what it is. And it's literally extreme horror cinema at its finest. That was House of a Thousand Corpses. Its sequel, The Devil's Rejects, acts in 3 different parts. You have the slasher, you have the road movie, and you have the revenge against the Firefly clan. So the slasher pits the 3 from Hell in like a hotel room, and they just invade this traveling band, and they kill them off one by one. Very, very brutally. The road movie is just them on the run from the law, and the revenge is when they get shot down by bullets at the very end. And the very end is awesome. because it's like a 5-minute montage of Freebird. But then the three from hell get annihilated by gunfire. It's a really Bonnie and Clyde-esque ending. I think this movie is a little bit better than House of a Thousand Corpses. It has more of a story, and the characters are more developed. So that was The Devil's Rejects. Followed by, and I really regret not watching this on Friday the 13th, but I watched it like a couple days before Friday the 13th. I rewatched Freddy vs. Jason. I don't know. But this is came out 20 years ago in 2003. And this is just your Freddy vs. Jason showdown with teenagers and the plot. So, I remember my experience watching this movie for the first time in theaters with my dad, and I had a blast with it. So, I was 13 at the time. This was made for 13-year-old me because I've already been familiar with Freddy and Jason. So essentially, Freddy revived Jason to make the people of Elm Street remember Freddy Krueger, but it turns out Jason just went on a killing spree on his own. This movie is silly and very melodramatic, but man, I have a blast with it. That was Freddy vs. Jason. And not to mention, you also have Kelly Rowland in here from Destiny's Child, of all things. That sounded very 2000s. I don't know. But that was Freddy vs. Jason. Followed by Dark Harvest. And this was a straight-to-streaming movie that came out of nowhere. And this is based off of a book by Norman Partridge. And it's just a really, I don't want to say cute Halloween novella, but it's just a Hunger Games-esque novel that pits the boys of a small town against the October Boy or Sawtooth Jack, which is like a scarecrow with a pumpkin head. And whoever kills the scarecrow wins an X amount of money, but if you win, you become Sawtooth Jack. I really enjoyed this movie. It's really, really slow, but once it got going, it's a blast. And it's actually really gory as well. This is rated R, so it had to be gory some way. It ain't Terrifier gory, but it's still a really fun folk horror slasher in a way. And I really did like the 60s backdrop to it as well. So I wouldn't call this like a gateway horror movie, but I can see like teens really enjoying it. But that was Dark Harvest. Followed by the one movie that I really wanted to not talk about ever, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Yeah, I finally watched that. And it was bad. So, this features like the Winnie the Pooh characters, of course, but they are like hillbilly slashers. So, Christopher Robin left the 100-acre wood for college, and the animals became ravenous, and they had to like rely on cannibalism to survive. So they ate Eeyore, and the only two survivors, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. This movie was a mess, and it really hurt me to actually like watch it. I even like made a new grade. I gave this an F minus. The kills were extremely mundane and just one hit and you're dead. And this movie was bad. Easily the worst movie that I've seen this year. And it hasn't been that great of a year of movies. I will say that. But this is by far my least favorite. So, that was Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. And that was also part of that video that I mentioned earlier. But I also talked about Children of the Corn in that video. So I just have like differing opinions on those 4 movies. Check it out if you're interested. But moving on, I have my next dual review, Terrifier. And this is probably like the 3rd time I rewatched this. And it's very high on my top 50 horror movies. Like, I think it's at like number 10. But this is like a good old fashioned slasher from like the 70s. It has that vibe where it's just about 2 women who are stalked by this mime, and we know him as Art the Clown. This dude is sadistic. You don't even know where he came from, but it takes place on Halloween night, and these 2 women are in a pizzeria, and he just comes in, and he has like a trash bag full of God knows what, and it starts getting kind of weird. But when they leave, Art the Clown just annihilates the pizzeria workers. And you get your first look at one of the most brutal slashers that I've ever seen. But the second one is 10 times more brutal. But I'll get into that in a minute. The noteworthy kill in this movie has to be the hacksaw kill. It's like relentlessly brutal. So he has like the blonde chick bound and gagged, and she's like hanging upside down. She's topless, and Art the Clown just like rips off her panties and just uses like a hacksaw and just goes midsection to her head, and you see everything. There is a lot of blood and guts. Ugh. But I do believe that this is going to be like a new horror icon, and I would definitely rewatch these movies a lot. They're not for everybody, but man, the brutality of it. Woof. So that was Terrifier. The sequel, Terrifier 2. I like that cover a lot better. So I watched this for the second time to prepare for this video, and this movie is 2 hours and 18 minutes of just blood-soaked gore. This was in my top 10 best movies of last year, and this ended up at number 5 in my top 50 horror movies of all time. This movie is even more brutal than the original. Sienna is a great final girl, and Art the Clown is just creepy. The bedroom scene is the noteworthy scene in here, and the nightmare sequence is terrifying also. But I will say the climax of this movie just drags. But this is a kick-ass movie, and I love it. That was Terrifier 2. Followed by a rewatch of The Black Phone. And I've been meaning to rewatch this for the longest time. So I watched it one night with my sister, and it still holds up very, very well. So this is based off of a Joe Hill short story where you have this creeper that is only referred to as the Grabber. He abducts children and keeps them in his basement, and about like a 10-year-old boy gets abducted, and he has to fight to survive. Really good movie, and a really good antagonist played by Ethan Hawke. And we are getting a sequel in June of 2025. So I'm very much looking forward to a sequel to this. I haven't read the story yet, but I will soon. The Black Phone. And I have 5 more movies to talk about. So, continuing on, I rewatched The Conjuring, and this was the last dual review that I did in October, leading into the top 50 horror movies. This is just one of the best haunted house movies, and it takes a case from Ed and Lorraine Warren, and they have to help the Perron family from Bathsheba, which is like a witch who possesses mothers, and she has the mothers kill their youngest kid. Really creepy and extremely messed up. That was The Conjuring. And not to mention the hide and clap sequence, terrifying after 10 years. And you also have the introduction to Annabelle in here, which is kind of like my least favorite aspect of the Conjuring verse. But I did enjoy Annabelle Comes Home. I just don't care for many of these Conjuring spin-off movies. But that one was pretty good. But that was The Conjuring. And then I watched the final movie that I saw in theaters, Killers of the Flower Moon. And this was one of my most anticipated movies of the fall. Well, technically it was my most anticipated movie of the fall because Dune Part 2 got delayed. But anyway, this is based off of David Grann's nonfiction book about the Osage Massacre and the birth of the FBI in 1920s Oklahoma. So, this stars Robert De Niro, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jesse Plemons, and so many other people. This is a long movie. It's 3 hours and 27 minutes, but it really felt like a 2.5 hour movie. The pacing was on point, and I was just engaged with the story. Did it have to be 3.5 hours? Not really. But that's what Martin Scorsese does at his finest. He just makes long epics. But I really did enjoy this movie quite a bit. And I do have a review on the channel. So that was Killers of the Flower Moon. Followed by The Conjuring 2. And this brings the Warrens to Enfield, England. And their case is the Enfield poltergeist, which is deemed to be England's Amityville. Which, not to mention, the opening case in here is Amityville. I think this movie is better than the original. Take it for what it is. But I find this to be extremely terrifying. But the entity haunting this family possesses the middle girl, and she is possessed by like an older man who actually died in the house, and you actually like hear some of the audio recording. It's disturbing. But the old man was just a pawn because you had the introduction of Valak, which you know as the nun. But seen this quite a few times, and I really dig it. Also acts as a good Christmas haunting movie as well, because it takes place a couple days before Christmas. But that was The Conjuring 2. Followed by Five Nights at Freddy's. And I didn't go to the theater for this one. I actually watched it on Peacock. This movie was fine, but I know nothing of Five Nights at Freddy's. But this is basically based off of a horror video game that really caters to like young kids and teenagers. But this is basically like a Chuck E. Cheese from hell. So these animatronics were like possessed by ghost children that were killed by like a pedophile. And Josh Hutcherson is a new security guard, and he has to look over the place while dealing with these animatronics. I wanted this movie to be a little bit more scarier, and I also wanted it to be more of a slasher. There is one part of gore in here where, like, the girl gets chopped in half, but that's about it. But I definitely do see this as a gateway horror movie. And it is definitely made for hardcore fans of Five Nights at Freddy's. But I did enjoy it for what it was, but I don't think I would ever rewatch this again. The villain was so easy to predict, but Matthew Lillard is barely in this movie, and I automatically knew that he was the villain. It was that obvious. So that was Five Nights at Freddy's. A fine gateway horror movie. Final movie I watched was The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Now, I didn't have any plans to rewatch this, but it had been a while, and I watched the other two, so why not? This came out in 2021, and this takes place in, like, the 80s, and this features the case of Arnie Johnson. So at the time that this movie came out, that case was 40 years old. Yo, how time flies. But Arnie Johnson was, like, possessed by some demon that came out of, like, his girlfriend's brother, and he actually murdered his boss. This acts like a courtroom drama with a little bit of supernatural activity. Not very memorable, and the villain is actually a human. She's kind of like into voodoo, and she controls some people to, like, do horrendous things. I don't outright hate this movie, but it's just one that's not going to be in my rotation. It's just fine. But that was The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. And those are the 19 movies I watched in October. Again, I apologize for the delay. It was a very, very tiring weekend that I had. I was still tired yesterday, so I decided to just throw out this video tonight, and I'll put it up tomorrow. But tomorrow I'm going to go see the Marvels, and I rewatched Captain Marvel tonight, so I'll have a dual review on that coming Friday. But other than that, I don't have many other YouTube plans at this moment. I will go see The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and Thanksgiving. I'll try and squeeze in The Holdovers, but I don't know if I'm going to make that because that's a very small movie. But I definitely do want to see Thanksgiving and the new Hunger Games movie. So, that's all I got for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll see you Friday for my Captain Marvel and the Marvels Dual Review. See you in the next one. Adios. Peace.